So in this next class, we are wanting to look at some other developments in science, including the development of the understanding of atoms as a scientific explanation. So Aristotle was developing a number of arguments, but interestingly, he couldn't see atoms, and so he took a stand against atoms. Whereas other Greek thinkers, such as Democritus and others, argued, a bit like Plato, that the idea of atoms made sense. Galileo, after introducing the idea of atoms, was persuaded that it wouldn't work with the mathematical understanding that he had, and so his theoretical understanding led him to reject the notion of atoms. So I think, again, this reminds us that there is more going on than what you can observe. René Descartes also thought about the possibility of atoms, and Robert Boyle, he felt that we should focus on experimental research than speculating about the possibility of atoms. Isaac Newton assumed the possibility of the existence of atoms with attractive and repulsive thoughts, because Newton is working not only with what he can see, such as light, and using a prism and separating it into the colours of the rainbow. Newton's also open to the idea of revelation of God, about the way the universe runs, and that there could be laws of gravity, and that there could be ways in which God has made light and God has made matter. And so it's openness to new ways of thinking that leads Newton to an openness to the ideas of atoms. John Dalton, an English chemist, is credited with the first modern atomic theory. And again, it's this way of thinking about the way the world is structured that leads to different ways that we can understand the world around us. And often we're not only describing what we can see in science, we're describing models to understand the unseen world. And it was Ernest Rutherford, a physicist from New Zealand who spent much of his life in England and Canada, who did a famous gold foil experiment, fired a thin beam of alpha particles at a sheet of gold, and some of them bounced straight back at him. And it was a very small number that did this. And this led to the hypothesis that an atom has a very small nucleus, which led to the study of the nucleus. If the electron is charged negative, the nucleus must have the positive charge in to give an overall balance of charge. And his nuclear model then took hold, and then neutrons were then discovered as another part of the atom. Interestingly, this discovery and development of atomic theory was associated partly with the rejection of Aristotle's ideas of observation, and with the idea that it's the unseen realms, such as the atoms, that are going to be important for understanding the world. Common to the 16th and 17th century ideas was the notion that God reveals himself in two books, one being the Bible, and so many of the scientists were reading the Bible, not all, and also the natural world, which people were motivated to read as part of God's revelation. And Boyle and others like Gassendi said that if God has free will and he's given us free will, then we're to be responsible to study the natural world to discover what it's made of. This led to some to believe the natural world was like a machine, and Aristotle described it a bit that way, but really believing in God making the world realizes that it's much more than a machine. There is more to it. So Peter Harrison in his writings describes some of these developments, and you could look at these. Isley says that partly what makes the origins of science in the 1700s unique is that the Christian believers in Christian countries were using their ideas about the laws of God to motivate them. But there are others like William Drapier and Andrew Dixon White that wanted to be free of religion and wrote it into their histories and said that science wants to be free of religion. And so often the way a person thinks and is becomes the history that they write. The Christian value of the material world John Calvin describes also leads to a contribution to science and understanding the scientific world as we see it. So again, further evidence for understanding the scientific world. I want to go now to share a few thoughts that I've put together on one particular branch of science, moving away from the physics and chemistry and astronomy to psychology, a human science. And in this paper I want to briefly describe now, I want to argue that the history of psychology has also seen a tension between describing the human person as a machine, where simply what we observe describes a human person, or thinking beyond what we can see to see that a human person is much more than a machine. So a significant revolution in the 1800s is not only taking place in the understanding of chemistry and physics, but also in the way in which we understand psychology. So if you turn to a psychology book like James Callett's Introduction to Psychology, we see the statement that 19th century scholars advocated a scientific approach being made in physics and chemistry and biology, looking for causes in what we can see, assuming that there's a determinism, that everything's determined by what they can observe. The origin of psychology as we know it dates from 1879, when medical doctor, German sensory researcher Wilhelm Wundt set up the first psychological laboratory in Leipzig to measure people and what they were doing. So Wilhelm Wundt, he disagreed with people like Galileo, Comte, Kant, who claimed psychology will never be a science because how can you describe people simply by observing and using numbers? Then we need to understand the complexity of the human person. In Hergenham's History of Psychology, we see the view that God is dead is partly related to the origins of psychology as we move free from religion, and we have to look at the different influences now, and a more humanistic approach is taken whereby we consider evolutionary approaches and we consider the way things are. Another introduction to psychology talks about the empirical scientific approaches to psychology, and Professor of Psychology at Harvard, Steven Pinker, argues for history showing that the Enlightenment arrived, empirical studies triumphed in giving us a greater understanding of the human person. I want to argue that similar to what we've seen with physics and chemistry, there are Christian roles in understanding psychology, and we don't just have to look at psychology from observing, describing, measuring human beings, that Christians can be involved as well. So it's possible that just describing the human person in terms of maths and measurement, we can actually dehumanize people. And if we use this in psychology and counseling and pastoral care, we may not be treating people well. Robinson, in Historiography in Psychology, says the history of psychology deals with a series of engagements with issues in understanding the human person that have been around for 2,000 years. That is, the Greeks studied the human person. And Augustine in 400 studied the human person. And Aquinas in 1100 studied the human person. And Martin Luther wrote about the human person, as did John Calvin. So it's not new. And psychology is not new. Plato described human thought and how human knowledge exists, and human tendencies in the way of thinking. And Robinson, in his History of Psychology, says a persistent theme in books and essays concerning the history of psychology is that they either forget about ancient developments and medieval developments, simply focus on the modern, or they are oversimplistic, or they ignore other developments. They don't really look at the history as well. They forget that Plato wrote about the human life is like a charioteer pulled by a white horse and a black horse. That is, you've got the seat of the intellect, and then you've also got the uplifting spiritual attitudes and emotions and feelings, and then you've got the deeper desires and appetites that are all driving the human person. This is 2,000 years ago. Freud writes similar material back in his Freudian writings. And so the human person is more complex, and the discussion of the human person has been around. Aristotle too talked about grasping anything trustworthy concerning the soul. It's a complex affair. And he talked about the need that is needed, because Aristotle was responsible for a book about the soul he's long credited for being the father of psychology, but in some ways it was Plato and others who were also describing the nature of the human person. So two models are proposed for the kind of discipline that psychology was to become. William Wundt's model of psychology, which you just measure people and how they react and do things. And then the other is the more human model of psychology that realizes the complex nature of the person. Alex and Shelley Ann, what are your thoughts? And what's the strengths and weaknesses of this empirical, observable model of psychology, or the more human model that realizes that humans are complex? Alex?
Yeah, I think I'd probably lean towards agreeing with the psychology that humans are complex beings, because that's just my view, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Yeah, Shelley Ann, what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess I don't like to over spiritualize psychology when someone has a mental health issue.
Yeah.
You know, it can be helpful to approach it from a medical model, not only a spiritual model. And that's been my experience. But yeah, and then the other side is that we just don't even sort of, like, I was in a class today and we were like, what sort of things, inform ethics, and no one put their hand up and said, like, people are reluctant to say religion and spirituality. They're very, it's the last thing that psychologists want to talk about is, and it makes them uncomfortable if they don't have their own faith. So I think they're kind of, at the moment, going to a psychologist, often Christians want to go to a Christian psychologist, don't they? Probably for these reasons, where they're looking at the whole self. But I guess I don't also like to say, well, let's just go to a healing service and we'll heal your mental health issues, because, like, we also have science for a reason where we can say, well, you're just lacking this, or you've got an infection and we can give you some antibiotics. So I find I don't know where the happy medium is at all.
And I think you describe it well as the importance of a happy medium is that sometimes tablets are very important, and sometimes very straightforward counselling wisdom is important. And other times you want someone who's going to come alongside and support your faith and pray with you. And so I think all of these models are going to be important. So Dassinger, in Psychology and Its History, writes about the complex interaction of these different approaches and says that as with the other forms of science, we have to be careful not to describe them oversimplistically as free of religion, or as you've said, Shelley Ann, have totally engulfed in religion so that there's no science left in it. We need to recognize the diversity of skills. And just like you go to a dentist because you want the skills there, and you go to a foot person or a skin person, different areas are going to have different expertise. And sometimes you've got to go to these different people. And in the same way, Christian psychologists and Christian counselors each have a contribution to make as well. So during the relative short history as a discipline, psychology is accompanied by a study of the history of its subdisciplines that recognizes that there's a diversity of subdisciplines involved. So it's true that one founded a particular psychological laboratory in Leipzig in 1879, 1880, where he could measure certain responses. And these histories of psychology, however, often overlook alternate psychologies and other models of psychology. Certainly, this approach to psychology leads to behaviorism, like Pavlov's dog, where you ring a bell as they eat, and eventually they associate the bell with the food. I don't know whether you can do that with students who do well, etc. But again, is that all a human person is? Someone who responds to a bell? And is that all that a dog is? And I know my children have got pet dogs. Is that all that they are? So behaviorism holds that the subject matter is the behavior of the human person. And Pavlov and others, particularly John Watson, who became a strong advocate of behaviorism, saw value in that. And there can be value in each of these approaches to psychology, but it's not the only form of psychology. As a matter of fact, if you go back 50 or 80 years earlier in Copenhagen, in Denmark, Frederick Christian Sibbern, professor of philosophy at the time, was teaching psychology, and he made a strong connection between psychology and the arts and the sciences to fully understand the human person. So yes, he would include some of his studies on scientific psychology and measurement, but he said there's also value in poetry, and there's also value in Bible and in spiritual formation and prayer. And so he developed a different form of psychology that was integrated with the humanities, poetry, and it was also integrated with faith. One of his students was Soren Kierkegaard, and Soren Kierkegaard argues against the scientific approach to understanding the human person. In his concluding unscientific postscript, Soren Kierkegaard rejects the possibility of fully understanding a human person if you're going to be objective and empirical. So to understand intelligence by simply giving an IQ test, and you sit down and you mark it, and the teacher marks it and gives it back and says, this is your IQ, we need to realize that people perform differently in different conditions and different stages and ages and times and settings. People are more complex. Intelligence is more complex, I think Soren Kierkegaard will say. So Immanuel Kant and Soren Kierkegaard are talking about a different approach to psychology. And Immanuel Kant wrote Critique of Pure Reason, in which he showed the nature and limits of reason. That is, sure, you can understand a human person using reasoning, but it's limited. We need more than this. And this is what Soren Kierkegaard is trying to do in his descriptions of psychology. Kierkegaard recognizes the dangers in simply giving epistemological measurement primacy over a simplified, objectified scientism. I have described the student. The student is thus. And if you do that in week one primary school, then they're going to be stuck with that label. Whereas if you work with more of the mystery of the human person, and more that they've been created with potential by God, then we could understand a lot more of the human person, Soren Kierkegaard would suggest. Soren Kierkegaard wrote Fear and Trembling and Sickness Under Death, in which he talks about the challenge of individuals and humanity as they face the tension, not only that which is finite and measurable, but that which is infinite and difficult to measure, the huge size of the universe, the huge size of hope, the huge size of human potential, and also the huge size of human sin and how bad people can be and how good people can be. So Kierkegaard encourages us to recognize not only the temporal, spatially bounded, limited world, but also the unlimited eternal realms that Christians believe are in God. That as humans have potential to be much more than they are at the moment, and that a positive psychology that taps into this potential might be more valuable than simply measuring where people are at and saying, this is your problem, this is what I measure. In Sickness Unto Death, Soren Kierkegaard talks about despair that arises from our unawareness, despair that arises from not accepting our true self, despair that arises from an awareness of the self that we ought to be and should be, but we're not able to accept the love and infinitude and possibility that enables us to become there. Really, his psychology touches on formation, character formation, spiritual formation, as it did in the ancient world through to more recent times. To be free of despair is to accept one's self and the power to become the people we're being called to do, he says in Sickness Unto Death. Eternity asks you and every individual one thing, whether you're going to live in despair and limitation or not, whether you're going to step into your potential in God. So a man's life is wasted when he deceives himself, but he needs to go beyond that to discover his who he could be. In contrast to science that focuses on objectivity, I'm going to see it, measure it, describe it. Kierkegaard says true psychology is subjective. It talks about who do you want to be? Who could you be? Who can you imagine yourself being? These are the unseen realms that are also important in psychology. If you just simply describe who you are, then you can lose yourself. You simply accept the limits of where you are at the moment. But if you can describe the unseen realms of hope and potential, then such as you find in Christianity and faith, then you can become whom you're able to be. In Sickness Unto Death, he writes, everything that is Christian is similar to a physician by a sick bed. If we realize that there are people next to us who are sick on the bed and that we have a contribution that can bring healing and life to them, then that's what we should be doing. So a reflective person is open to freedom and choice, says Soren Kierkegaard. So this is sometimes described as existentialism, to truly exist, and it recognizes that there is that which is beyond us. Martin Buber, who also writes similarly, says that instead of psychology describing me, I should be describing the other, you, and also describing God, the ultimate other. Yolem talks about the seeking of meaning, and Viktor Frankl talks about the positive hope of who we could be. So Carl Rogers and Rollo May, Viktor Frankl, Erich Fromm, and Ludwig talk about a humanistic psychology that recognizes human potential, recognizes anxiety and what its purpose is in our life and how to handle it, and recognizes the curious possibility that we should accept ourselves just as I am, and only then can we change, says Carl Rogers. Viktor Frankl writes, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, freedom to choose one's attitude and response to circumstance. Existential psychology is a different form of science. So it's wanting to go beyond the restrictive behavioralism of a scientific approach to recognize a different approach to science, which is more open to potential. Martin Buber's I, thou wants us to be less focused on the self and more focused on the ultimate, on the other, which for Christians is God, which is a healthy way of taking us forward. Paul Tillich describes this as the courage to be, to have faith in life, faith that we can be who we're called to be. And C.P. Snow in his Two Cultures said that we are facing this tension between a scientific revolution that just focuses on a narrow view of science, and then a wider understanding of science and psychology as connected to the wider culture and connected to a more human understanding of all that a human person is. So there are benefits in being objective and empirical and measuring, but Kierkegaard and humanist psychologists show us that there is another way of understanding the human person that goes beyond that, and Christians understand that bigger understanding of the world. So hopefully that expands your ideas. Shelley-Ann, what are your thoughts about Soren Kierkegaard and others' ideas that a scientific understanding of the human person as teachers and as psychologists should go beyond simply giving a test, measuring something and putting a label on a person, but being more human?
Well, yeah, I have a question about Kierkegaard being a Christian and his use of that subjectivity versus objectivity struggle. How is that different to how people use the word subjectivity today when they say, well, my truth is my truth and your truth is your truth? Is that he's coming at that from a Christian experience is one to be lived? Is that, how do you?
Yeah, so certainly subjectivity's got a bad name. And
yes.
Soren Kierkegaard said that was the danger with the objectivity of science model, is that it will get a bad name. However, he says if you're totally objective and stick labels on everything, then you can't truly live. That is, if you come from a certain suburb and you're of a certain gender and you had a certain grade, how you truly live. And he says, my truth is important. He says that you have to own your own reality. But he goes further. He says, take responsibility for your subjective truth. So don't give up your subjective truth and don't live in a dream. So don't live in a false subjectivity. So a false subjectivity is where I think I'm Superman, I can don't believe in God. I mean, Kierkegaard argues that true subjectivity must be open to the existential nature of the universe. That is, you can't get out of this universe alive, you're going to die. But the universe is so vast and fascinating that there's possibly a God there. And the evidence sort of points towards it, even if it's 60 or 70% towards it. Therefore, Kierkegaard says you have to take a leap of faith. That is, you can either stay stuck in your objectivity, you know, I don't have enough knowledge to believe in God, or you can take a leap of faith and say, I've got a little bit of knowledge, I'm going to now declare my subjectivity, I'm going to declare I'm leaping in faith towards God. I trust you, I believe you, I trust you there, you're going to open up doors for me. He says, life is about subjective leaps of faith, but he says you've got to make them as real as possible. But he says simply observing what is won't make it real. It'll help you, but you don't know where you're going to be tomorrow. You don't know the fullness of happiness that you've been born for. A lot of it's beyond. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And it's the opposite of today's adolescent, fatalistic, passive, my truth is just my lived experience. And it's like he's saying he's going to be active in his exploration of his world and change and open to change.
Absolutely, and open to this huge, big change that's almost scary in that it's big beyond what you can imagine. I mean, your potential is huge, and your potential to sin and go wrong is huge. When you hop into a car, the potential to crash, it's huge. The potential to get somewhere in the car is huge. And so subjectivity, he says, don't throw the subjectivity out with the scientific objectivity bathwater. Realize that it's so important. And with your students, every student should understand they're an active choosing agent for their own life, for their own views, and they need to take responsibility for every aspect of their thoughts. So their thoughts are part of their choices, their actions are part of their choices, and you're never totally lost. You may not do your homework for 6 months, but there's always an opportunity to turn around and change. Yeah.
That's what I really liked about John Lloyd was his quote about the fact that he moved around so much and when he changed lots.
Yeah, so good. Alex, what are your thoughts on Kierkegaard's alternate view of a scientific understanding of the human person?
Yeah, I just agree with what you were just sort of talking about, but I guess I don't have too much to add, sorry.
Yeah, no, sounds good. And Gabriella and then Belinda. Gabriella, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he's obviously a very clever man in terms of being able to think beyond just the science and I don't know. It's just interesting to hear his thinking, which is cool.
Yeah. So it's a science that goes beyond the science of simply objectively measuring. And I think this is what Plato was saying before Aristotle objectifies things. And this is what Isaac Newton is saying, is that you can't just measure the movement of something. You've got to take a leap of understanding that there could be gravity, that there could be light, could be broken up into particles. You've got to be willing to take these leaps because God could have put laws in place that are bigger than our understanding. And the same with understanding a human person. It can be bigger than just what we can measure of a human person. It can be bigger than just a few neurons that are firing. There's more going on in the human person. Yeah. Belinda, and then Sally, and then Kieran.
So from I just really liked how one of the things that we mentioned was that people perform, like when we're looking at like the IQs and things like that, that it can't be measured in just one specific instance. It's, you perform differently in varying environments. That was one of the,
So good. And Sally Ann, Sally.
I don't think I have anything to add at this point.
Yep, and Kieran.
Yeah, me neither.
And back to Shelley Ann. Do you have anything further to add?
I just love that because I'm catching up. I got to meet John Lloyd and the creator of all those things that I love, and how I was just saying before how he moved around heaps with his dad and he'd gone to heaps of different countries and he adapted and adapted and adapted, and he just embraced change, which so many of our decisions we try and keep really on the safe side. We just want to make the smallest change, and we might move to this school, and if it won't work out, it's sort of, and even as teachers in our jobs, we want to make the safest choice. And sometimes just embracing change because we learn so much, even if it's just for 12 months. Maybe we should be a little bit more open to these bigger ideas and learning in life, as opposed to trying to nail our mortgage and nail our our assets. We should nail our learning ourselves instead.
And I think that's what a Christian approach to science and psychology and teaching is about, is dreaming big dreams, having big hopes, having a sense of meaning and purpose in the students' lives that goes beyond what the immediate tells them is out there. And if science is simply describing this is where you are at the moment, this is the environment you're in, this is the result of the tests we're giving, they're very important at times. But faith tells us that there is something beyond that. And I guess in medical terms, you may catch COVID, you may go to a doctor and he might tell you you've got COVID, you take these tablets, this will help, you might need a breathing machine, etc. But faith says that God might have a purpose for you beyond this illness. God might have purposes for you in the future. And it's that courage to live in faith. Paul Tillich describes the courage to take what appears to be meaningless in the present and with scientific measurement of the present, and to live in a faith that goes beyond the present, recognizes the power of possibility beyond this life, lives a much bigger life, a much bigger possible world. So,
And
yeah.
And if anyone hasn't read Viktor Frankl, they're so totally like eatable books. They're not big. And he's survived Auschwitz, and he doesn't say he's a Christian though, does he, Sam?
No, it's probably more Jewish in that sense as well, but there's some really great insights there. So we'll draw it together there. Does anyone have any questions about assignment? So reminder, we've mentioned the forums, and we've also mentioned there so the date of the assignment has now moved from the 24th to the 1st, so it's 7 days later there. Any other questions about the assignment? Karen?
What time is it due?
What time is it due on the Sunday?
Yeah.
I think it tells you on the post, and I think it's about 11 something. Do you remember, Shelley-Ann?
It's usually 11:55, and if you don't start submitting by 11:55, you'll be shut out. Like you'll be shut out.
Do they get half their assignment in if they get a half in or something? Yeah, so it gets chopped.
No, then you'll get an email.
Yes, I could imagine. Yeah.
What do we need to understand Vardy in a bigger sense than just the quote?